Hello, my name is Kristen Bolden, and welcome to The Other Side of History. In our last talk in this series on the history of the Reformation, we talked about Martin Luther nailing his 95 Theses to the church door there at Wittenberg. Now, in this talk, I would like to continue giving some of the aftermath of what happened after Martin Luther nailed these theses to that church door. Now, Luther's theses, they spread throughout all of Germany in no time. In fact, only in a matter of a few weeks, they had echoed throughout all of Europe. Many Roman Catholics read them with joy. They recognized the voice of God in them. They felt that the Lord had begun to act in stopping the rising tide of corruption that was coming from Rome. Secretly, princes and magistrates, they rejoiced that perhaps a limit was to be put on the arrogant power that denied the right to appeal from its decisions. Of course, the church leaders were enraged to see their profits endangered. Who does not know, said Martin Luther, that it is rare for someone to suggest any new idea without being accused of stirring up quarrels? Why were Christ and all the martyrs put to death? Because they advanced novelties without having first humbly taken counsel of the established religious leaders. End quote. Now remember Reuchlin, which was Philip Melanchthon's uncle. When he read Luther's theses, he said, "Thanks be to God. He was wearied of the rude combat that he had to fight against the monks. He was impressed by the strength that was displayed by Martin Luther in his theses, and it restored joy to his desponding heart. At last, they had found a man, he said, who will give them so much to do that they will be compelled to let my old age end in peace." Now, when the Elector of Saxony, Frederick the Wise, was asked his opinion on Luther's business, he replied with a smile, "I am not at all surprised that it has made so much noise, for he has committed two unpardonable crimes. He has attacked the Pope's tiara and the monks' bellies." Now, there is a mountain in Wittenberg that, if you're a hiker, you can actually go and hike up this mountain. If you Google pictures from the top of this mountain, you can see the surrounding area is very beautiful. Now, Wittenberg actually means white mountain. And a man by the name of Matthias, who actually became a Lutheran reformer, he played on the meaning of the name Wittenberg. He said, "All the world will go and seek wisdom on that mountain, and will find it." One of the doctors, a Dr. Fleck, one day he found Luther's theses posted up in the refectory, which was the room used for communal meals at an educational or a religious institution. And the doctor, he went up to these posted theses and he began to read them. He had perused only a few of the theses when, unable to contain his joy, he exclaimed, "Ah, he whom we have so long expected to come at last, and he will show you monks a trick or two." Now, an aged priest, having received and read the theses in his personage, he shook his head and he said in Low German, "Dear Martin Luther, if you succeed in overthrowing this purgatory and all these paper dealers, You will be a fine fellow indeed. Now, Lorenzo von Bibra, he was actually an important duke at this time period. He was the prince bishop of the bishopric of Würzburg, and also the advisor to the Emperor Maximilian. Being a pious, wise, and worthy man, the emperor and all of the princes, they held this duke in high esteem. He was one who mourned over the disorders of the church, and above all, over those of the convents. When Luther's theses reached his palace, he read them with great joy, and he publicly declared that he approved of Luther. He even wrote to the Elector Frederick, "Do not let the pious Dr. Martin go, for they do him wrong." Of course, the Elector Frederick, he was delighted at this testimony, and he had it communicated to Martin Luther with his own hand. Now, the Emperor Maximilian was the predecessor of Charles V, and when he read the theses, it is said that he admired the monk of Wittenberg. He was able to perceive his ability and foresaw that this obscure Augustine might one day become a powerful ally for Germany in her struggle against Rome. He told the Elector of Saxony, through his envoy, "Take great care of the monk Luther, for the time may come when we shall have need of him." These are some very interesting statements from some very powerful people at this time period in Earth's history. Maximilian was also known to have said to the Elector's privy councillor, "Well, what is your Augustine doing?" In truth, his propositions are not contemptible. He will play the monks a pretty game. End quote. So you would think that there would certainly not be any sympathy towards Luther from Rome, but this was actually not the case. Even in the Vatican, the theses at first were not so badly received as might have been imagined. Now, Pope Leo X, he judged rather as a patron of letters than as a pope. The theses gave him amusement and made him forget the severe truths that they contained. When he was asked to treat Luther as a heretic, he replied, "Brother Martin Luther is a very fine genius, and all that is said against him is mere monkish jealousy." Now, that is not something that you would expect to have heard from the Pope. It seems that Luther also had good sentiments towards the Pope. Of Leo X, Luther said, "I know that we may compare him to Daniel in Babylon. His innocence has often endangered his life." However, after the novelty of it all wore off, the actual encouragement from some of the leaders, it changed to criticism. Many officials of both church and state soon saw that the acceptance of these truths would eventually undermine Rome's authority. It would stop thousands of streams now flowing into her treasury and restrict the luxury of the papal leaders. Teaching the people to look to Christ alone for salvation would overthrow the Pope's throne and eventually destroy their own authority. As one historian put it, when Luther's theses were brought to him, "Thou art right, Brother Martin, but thou wilt not succeed. Poor monk, go to thy cell and cry, 'Lord, have mercy upon me.'" So Luther had nothing to do with the circulation of these theses. My design, said Luther, was not to give my theses such publicity. I only desire to confer on their contents with some of those who remain with us or near us. If they had been condemned, I would have destroyed them. If they had been approved of, I proposed to publish them. But they have now been printed over and over again and circulated so far beyond all my hopes that I repent of my offspring, not because I fear the truth should be made known to the people. 'Twas this alone that I sought, but that it is not the way to instruct them. They contain questions that are still doubtful to me, and if I had thought my theses would have created such a sensation, there are some things I should have omitted, and others I should have asserted with greater confidence. Now, in after years, Luther actually thought differently than this. Far from fearing that he had said too much, he declared that he ought to have said much more. The cautious Erasmus, he was in the Low Countries when Luther's theses first reached him. He internally rejoiced at witnessing his secret wishes for the rectifying of the abuse that was expressed with so much courage. Now, originally he approved of Luther, but he exhorted him only to greater moderation and prudence. Luther responded that God has given men a physician who cuts deep into the flesh, because the malady would otherwise be incurable. Luther's response to Tetzel's attacks on himself was this. He says, I fancy it as an ass braying at me. I am delighted with them, and I should be very sorry were such people to call me a good Christian. So Luther's name, it resounded everywhere from the pulpits of the Dominicans, who addressed themselves to the passions of the people. They called Luther a madman, a seducer, and a demoniac. His doctrine was cried down as the most horrible heresy. When Luther was informed of Tetzel's theses, which was a response to his 95 theses that he had posted, Luther said, I have more difficulty to refrain from despising my adversaries and from sinning in this way against Jesus Christ than I should have in conquering them. They are so ignorant of human and divine things that it is disgraceful to have to fight against them. And yet it is this very ignorance which gives them their inconceivable arrogance and their brazen face. Again, Luther, responding to his enemies, he said, They call me proud and arrogant. I will not deny that I am. But they are not the people to know either what God is or what we are. After Tetzel died, Rome called on Dr. Eck to deal with Luther. And we have actually already discussed some of the debate that went on between Luther and Dr. Eck. Now, Dr. Eck apparently did not feel good about how his conduct had been during the debates, and he tried to vindicate himself in a letter that he wrote to Karlstadt. Now, in the letter, he called Luther their common friend and cast all the blame on one of the bishops at whose solicitation he pretended to have written, actually, the work. The rupture that had been created between Dr. Eck and Martin Luther, it did make a great sensation there in Germany. They had many friends that were in common, and in the end, Eck's pride and his unstoppable spirit soon it broke entirely the last ties of friendship which of course just grew weaker and weaker every day. Sometime later, Rome also called on Erasmus to deal with Martin Luther. And this all had to be hurtful to some extent for Luther. Remember that he had at one time thought of Dr. Eck as his friend and had esteemed him. Luther also had great respect for Erasmus. It was Erasmus's Greek text of the Bible that had brought him to Christ. Luther, not knowing how to reconcile the respect that he felt for Erasmus's learning with the indignation that he felt at his timidity, he wrote in April of 1524 to Erasmus, and he said, "You have not yet received from the Lord the courage necessary to walk with us against the papists. We put up with your weakness. If learning flourishes, if by its means the treasures of Scripture are open to all, this is a gift which God has bestowed on us through you. Our thanksgiving ascends to heaven. But do not forsake the task that has been imposed upon you and pass over to our camp. No doubt your eloquence and genius might be very useful to us, but since you are wanting in courage, remain where you are. But on the other hand, my dear Erasmus, refrain from scattering over us with such profusion that pungent salt, which you know so well how to conceal under the flowers of rhetoric, for it is more dangerous to be slightly wounded by Erasmus than to be ground to powder by all the papists put together. Be satisfied to remain as spectator of our tragedy, and publish no books against me, and for my part, I will write none against you." Erasmus, he was fond of glory, and men, they were accusing him of fearing Luther and of being too weak to answer him. He was accustomed to the highest seat, and the little monk of Wittenberg had dethroned the mighty philosopher of Rotterdam. In attacking Luther, Erasmus selected the point where Romanism gets lost in rationalism, the doctrine of free will, or the natural power of man. There was nothing that Erasmus liked better than to talk about himself and his fame. "The Pope," wrote he with childish vanity to an intimate friend, at the period when he had declared himself the opponent of Luther. He says, "The Pope has sent me a diploma full of kindness and honorable testimonials. His secretary declares that this is an unprecedented honor, and that the Pope dictated every work himself." However, what was the end of Erasmus? He was as the dying man who was asked by the devil, "What do you believe?" The poor man, fearful of being caught in some heresy, if he should make a confession of his faith, he replied, "What the Church believes." The devil demanded, "And what does the Church believe?" The expiring man answered once more, "What I believe." One author described two heavens, the papal and the Christian. He found Erasmus in neither, but discovered him revolving between both in never-ending orbits. I want to be like Martin Luther, not Erasmus. Erasmus ended his days in depression and with a hatred of existence which he called a cruel life. How different would have been his outcome if he would have only abandoned self and sacrificed all for the truth. Luther, on the other hand, he stood alone against the mighty powers of earth. When human support failed, he looked to God alone. I believe that Martin Luther is a beautiful example of what we should be like in our uncertain times. If you have enjoyed this little talk, I would just like to encourage you to click on that like and subscribe button. Thank you for listening, And I am just praying that there will be God's blessings upon each one of you.